We're TTB, the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau.
Welcome to the TTB Bootcamp for Brewers webinar series. Today's webinar is called TTB Basics. This segment of the series will provide an overview of TTB, the functions we perform that are relevant to brewers, and TTB laws and regulations that apply to brewers. I'll pause for a moment before we begin to let you read our disclaimer. So it basically tells you that we're not here to establish any new guidance today or to set forth any new policy. If I happen to say something incorrectly that is contrary to the laws or regulations administered by TTB, it is those laws and regulations that supersede whatever I'm going to tell you today. I'm just trying to communicate those laws and regulations to you. In addition, if this is up on our website for a while and you'd like to watch it again, there is a chance that any of the information that we're sharing could be superseded and become outdated. So always consult the most recent regulations. And as I mentioned, our agenda, we'll go over an overview and then talk about our functions and how you can expect to interact with us. And then briefly, the laws and regulations that will apply to you. So we are a bureau in the Department of the Treasury. We are the newest office in the Department of the Treasury, formed in 2003, when the Homeland Security Act of 2002 split ATF into two. They went over to the Department of Justice, and we, TTB, were formed under the Department of the Treasury. We currently have about 500 people. Our headquarters are in Washington, D.C. We're right down the street from the main Treasury building and close to the White House. Our Office of Permitting Taxation is in Cincinnati, Ohio. And while I noted the locations of our main offices, headquarters, and permitting taxation, we're still very largely remote working. Some of us are remote working full-time, and some of us are going to the office occasionally to full-time. And I'm coming to you today from Portland, Oregon. And then additionally, we have field offices located across the country, including Puerto Rico. And our field offices are where our auditors and our investigators are. And then we also have 3 laboratories located in Maryland. So as you can see, we really are located throughout the country. So as I had noted, we are under the Department of Treasury. So we are a tax collection agency, a revenue agency for the US government. So the first element in our mission is to collect the taxes. We have a long and storied history of collecting taxes on behalf of the federal government. And in fact, the first ones were collected in 1791. Those were implemented by Alexander Hamilton on distilled spirits to finance the Revolutionary War. So while our bureau is only 20 years old, we continue to carry out a long history of taxing alcohol beverage products. And then in addition to tax collection, we also have functions to protect the public. We protect the consumer by ensuring the integrity of alcohol products. So we want consumers to know what they are purchasing and to have the label adequately and accurately reflect what is inside. We ensure only qualified businesses enter the alcohol and tobacco industries. And then we prevent the unfair and unlawful market activity for alcohol and tobacco products. We want to ensure a level playing field for those that are in the business. And I'll describe the functions that we perform in support of our mission in just a bit as I describe the laws that we carry out. So next is our organizational chart. This is not a comprehensive organizational chart, but it reflects the offices that you will most often interact with. Our administrator is Mary Ryan, and our deputy administrator is Dave Wolf. They lead the agency. And the offices I want to tell you about today are the Officing of Permitting and Taxation, Headquarters Operations, and Field Operations. So starting with Permitting and Taxation, which we refer to as PT, we have the National Revenue Center. The National Revenue Center, located in Cincinnati, is responsible for collecting tax revenues, issuing permits and brewers notices, approving notices, processing tax returns, operational reports, and claims. And there's their contact information. And then under headquarters operations, again, that's in Washington, D.C., we have our Alcohol Labeling and Formulation Division, the Scientific Services Division, that's where our labs are, and the Regulation and Rulings Division. That's the office that does our rulemaking and publishes guidance and other informational materials. But ALFD, the Alcohol Labeling and Formulation Division, they are the division that you will likely interact with the most. They process applications for formula and label approvals. So this is important contact information. And then finally, under our Office of Field Operations, we have our Trade Investigations Division, as well as our Tax Audit Division and our Market Compliance Office. Our investigators within our Trade Investigations Division are separated into 6 regions, which you can see on this map. We've also provided contact information on the next slide for each field office. And investigators are a fantastic resource for you if you have questions and want to speak with someone locally or who is familiar with your region. So take a moment and identify which region you're in. And then in this slide, we have the contact information for them. So I'll give you just a moment. This slide walks you through the typical touch points in which you can expect to interact with TTB. Your first touch point will be with our Office of Permitting and Taxation that I mentioned. This will be when you qualify as a brewery or brew pub by submitting your brewer's notice. Our next bootcamp module will cover the basics of what you need to know about submitting your brewer's notice. Brewer's notices can be submitted through our permits online system. Our customer service standard for processing brewer's notice is 75 days. And while processing times vary slightly throughout the year, you can typically expect brewer's notices to be processed in less than that. And our average time is currently 38 days. But again, that's going to fluctuate during the time of the year. Then next, you will apply for formula approval if you need it. Note that you will do this prior to producing your beer. And not all kinds of beer need formulas. In fact, most of them may not require formula approval, depending on what kind of beers you're planning on producing. Formula applications can be submitted through our formulas online system. We work really hard to keep processing times for those applications low. They are currently averaging just 1 day. Again, those are going to fluctuate, but our customer service standard for those is 15 days. If you aren't sure if you need a formula for your product, we have a handy tool online that you can use. You answer questions about what type of product it is, and it will walk you through whatever you need, or it will walk you through whether you need a formula. And we've recently updated the tool to make it even more user-friendly and intuitive. So definitely check it out if you are unsure whether your product needs formula approval. You can find that tool by searching for TTB, do I need a formula, in your favorite search engine. And we will cover formulas in our 4th bootcamp module. And then the next thing that you'll do is the fun thing, right? Produce your beer. Just as a reminder, as you're producing your beer, you do want to keep records. If you aren't sure what records to keep or in what format or how frequently, tune into our 3rd module of the bootcamp, Records, Operational Reports, and Tax Returns, where a representative from Permitting Taxation will talk you through all you need to know about records. Next, you'll apply for a label approval if you need it, if you are selling your beer in interstate commerce. Federal law requires all malt beverages, which I will define shortly, offered for sale in interstate commerce to have a certificate of label approval, which we refer to as a COLA for short. You can apply for COLAs in our COLAs online system. And again, we work really hard to keep processing times for those low. And our customer service standard is 15 days for those as well. And they are currently averaging just 5 days. But again, those will fluctuate a bit. And you can find all of our processing times on our website. So if you search TTB processing times in your favorite search engine, that should take you to the page where you can see the current processing times for all of our applications. Next, you will bottle or keg and sell your product. Then you will file your tax returns, pay your taxes, file your operational reports. And again, we'll be covering that in our 3rd module. And then finally, you'll need to report changes after qualification. We refer to those as amendments, and it doesn't necessarily happen in a specific place in the flow of things because it could happen at any time. Our next module on brewer's notices will walk you through what triggering events would require you to file an amendment. Now, getting into the laws and regulations. There are 2 primary laws that govern the regulations that we implement. This is not a complete list, but these are the 2 big ones that you'll want to be aware of. First, we have the Internal Revenue Code, the IRC for short, and that is implemented in Part 25 of the Code of Federal Regulations. Then we have the Federal Alcohol Administration Act, the FAA Act for short, and that's implemented at 27 CFR Part 7. And for those of you that don't spend your life studying laws and regulations, and congratulations if that's you, the difference between the laws and regulations is this. The law is what Congress passes, and it's smaller, more succinct than the regulations. It's sort of the framework, the bare bones of what needs to happen. The regulations are what implements the law. So the regulations are going to be a lot longer and contain a lot more detail. So again, the IRC, you'll find those regulations in 27 CFR Part 25, and then the FAA Act is at 27 CFR Part 7. And you will definitely want to get familiar with both sets of those regulations. So as I explain what each law and its implementing regulations contain, I'm going to stress the definitions that they include. So that's why this slide is up. The distinctions are really important in determining how your products are regulated. And there are two key terms that you will need to know: beer in the IRC and malt beverage in the FAA Act. So because it's so important, I'm just going to read this to you verbatim. The IRC defines beer as a beer, ale, porter, stout, and other similar fermented beverages, including sake and similar products of any name or description, containing 0.5% or more alcohol by volume, and brewed or produced from malt, wholly or in part, or from any substitute for malt. And continuing with the definition, only rice, grain of any kind, bran, glucose, sugar, and molasses are substitutes for malt. So again, that any of those can be substituted for malt. In addition, brewers may also use the following materials as adjuncts in fermenting beer: honey, fruit juice, fruit concentrate, herbs, spices, and other food materials. And you may use flavors and other non-beverage ingredients containing alcohol in producing beer in certain amounts. And the IRC applies to all beer produced in the US that contains 0.5% or more alcohol by volume. So unless you're producing low or no alcohol beer, the IRC applies to your products. And here are some, but not all of the things that it includes. And a good way to think about this is that it's the collect the revenue statute. So it's the things related to revenue. It includes requirements for your qualification, your record keeping requirements, and reports and taxes. It also contains formulas, and again, only for some alcohol beverage products, not all, and then minimum marks, brands, and labeling requirements. So the FAA Act is where most of your label requirements will come from. These are just very minimal ones in the IRC. Now, switching now to the FAA Act, and again, I will read this definition to you verbatim because it's so important. A malt beverage is a beverage made by the alcoholic fermentation of an infusion or decoction or combination of both in potable brewing water of malted barley with hops or their parts or their products, and with or without other malted cereals, and with or without the addition of unmalted or prepared cereals, other carbohydrates or products prepared therefrom, and with or without the addition of carbon dioxide, and with or without other wholesome products suitable for human food consumption. Now, this distinction is so important because the FAA Act only applies to products that are produced using both malted barley and hops. And also note that there is no minimum alcohol content requirement. So the FAA Act covers products containing malted barley and hops made by alcoholic fermentation, even if the finished product does not contain alcohol. And we will be covering more on low, no alcohol beers and malt beverages. And now you know the distinction of the two in our penultimate boot camp module. So that's our second to last. So another important distinction is the FAA Act applies to all domestic and imported malt beverages only if They are shipped in interstate commerce, that is shipped or sold in interstate commerce. Simply stated, the FAA Act provisions are only triggered when your malt beverages are shipped or sold in interstate commerce, so only when they're crossing state lines. And that includes labeling requirements. There's a robust set of labeling requirements that you will definitely want to be familiar with if you are producing these products and selling them in interstate commerce. And that's also where the requirement for obtaining a COLA comes from. And since label approval is only required for malt beverages sold or shipped in interstate commerce, bottlers of malt beverages do not need to obtain a COLA or certificate of label exemption for malt beverages if they are sold only in the state where they are bottled. And TTB ruling 2013-1 provides a more detailed explanation of these requirements in case you would like more information on that. There is one additional distinction relating to applying or related to the FAA Act to malt beverages. Once malt beverages cross state lines because they are sold or shipped to a particular state, the FAA Act labeling requirements only apply to these beverages to the extent that the laws of the state that they are being shipped into imposes similar labeling requirements. Did you get all that? It's a lot. But while the IRC is the collect the revenue statute, we sometimes refer to the FAA Act as the protect the public statute. To protect consumers, the FAA Act provisions ensure that labeling and advertising of alcohol beverages provide adequate information to the consumer concerning the identity and quality of the product. It requires that all alcohol beverage bottlers and importers must have an approved certificate of label approval. Again, that's the COLA that I mentioned for those products being sold or shipped into interstate commerce. And it prevents misleading labeling or advertising that may result in consumer deception regarding the product. We will have modules on both labeling and advertising later in the bootcamp series. Our alcohol labeling and formulation division will present on what you need to know about labeling requirements. In the advertising module, which we will present last, our market compliance office, again, that's in our Office of Field Operations, will go into more detail on advertising, including social media requirements. So getting back to the FAA Act provisions, finally, Congress also included provisions to prohibit anti-competitive practices that threaten the independence of retailers and or give industry members an unfair advantage over their competitors, which are referred to as trade practice provisions. So you can note it listed here as trade practices. The trade practice provisions cover exclusive outlet, tied house, commercial bribery, and consignment sales. And industry members who engage in these anti-competitive practices damage other law-abiding businesses and prevent consumers from enjoying a wide selection of products. We do have a set of 5 videos covering all of the basics that you would want to know about trade practices, and you can find that on our website. Just search for TTB trade practices. And then we also have an email box, tradepractices@ttb.gov. Again, that's tradepractices@ttb.gov that you can submit inquiries to. So if you have a question on whether or not a certain activity is allowed, you can submit your email to the Trade Practice Program Manager, and they will do an assessment and let you know whether that's an allowable activity or not, or a potential violation. So in summary, and this is important, a beer is not regulated as a malt beverage under the FAA Act, triggering all of those additional provisions, unless it contains both malted barley and hops. Malt beverages with less than 0.5% alcohol by volume are not taxed as beer under the IRC, but may be subject to FAA Act requirements. So you can see TTB ruling 2008-3, which is linked here for additional information. So these different definitions result in some quirky outcomes. For example, sake is beer under the Internal Revenue Code, but it is not a malt beverage under the FAA Act. And To make it even more interesting, it's the FAA Act's wine labeling rules that apply to sake if it's greater than or equal to 7% alcohol by volume. And then non-alcoholic, as I had mentioned, and that would be less than 0.5% alcohol by volume, and alcohol-free malt beverages are potentially subject to TTB label approval, even though they're not taxed and regulated under the Internal Revenue Code. And then we have hard seltzers, fermented from sugar and other beers made without both malted barley and hops. Those are never subject to TTB label approval. But as I had mentioned, they could be subject to TTB formula approval, because if you recall, those requirements come from the Internal Revenue Code as opposed to the FAA Act. And those products must be labeled in accordance with FDA food labeling requirements. Additionally, if hard seltzers contain more than 0.5% alcohol by volume, they must be labeled with the government health warning statement, and they need to comply with the IRC labeling requirements found in Part 25 of the TTB regulations. So if you've ever noticed how different the label of a hard seltzer can looks compared to a lager, for example, now you know the answer. And low, no alcohol and hard seltzers, as I had mentioned, those will be covered in more detail in the second to last, the penultimate module of this bootcamp series. With that, some resources that you might find to be helpful as you are either getting started or you want to keep up to date with all of the latest information and educational contact. So the first one that's on here, that's a link to the Office of Outreach. That's a web form that you can use to submit feedback, questions, or if you need assistance with anything. If you have suggestions, please contact us and let us know. We really do appreciate your feedback, good, bad, and all of the questions. So definitely get in touch with us. And then next we have our outreach events. Our outreach program page is a great source of information for where we'll be and when we'll be providing presentations. It will also have all of our webinar schedules and registration links on there. Conferences will also be listed with booths and presentations noted. And then finally, there's a link to the newsletter that I referenced earlier. And I hope this information was helpful to better understand TTB and the work that we do. Thank you so much for watching.
Visit TTB's official YouTube channel at USTTB.gov for more TTB-related content. And remember to click subscribe so you'll always know when we upload new videos.